The fluorescent lights of Portland General Hospital's maternity ward cast an eerie glow across the polished floors as I walk through the corridors at 2 a.m. 23 years have passed since I first entered a hospital like this one, terrified and alone at 17, clutching my swollen belly while nurses whispered about the teenage girl with no family in sight. Now the soft beeping of monitors and distant cries of newborns create a symphony I've grown to love, a soundtrack to the empire I built from nothing but determination and heartbreak. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My heels click against the linoleum as I approach the conference room where my legal team waits. Through the glass doors, I see 5 people hunched over documents, their faces illuminated by laptop screens. The emergency meeting was called just 3 hours ago, triggered by a phone call that shattered the peace I'd carefully constructed over 2 decades. Ms. Chen? My head attorney, Marcus Rivera, stands as I enter. His usually composed demeanor carries an edge of disbelief. We verified the information. Riverside Medical Center is indeed facing bankruptcy. They formally requested a buyout meeting. I set my purse on the mahogany table, my fingers trembling slightly as I process the irony. Riverside Medical Center, the hospital chain owned by my family, the same people who threw me out when I needed them most, now desperately needs the very thing they denied me: support. The morning sun streams through my corner office windows as I stare at the framed photo on my desk. It shows the groundbreaking ceremony for my first birthing center in Salem, Oregon, 7 years ago. I'm wearing a hard hat, 6 months pregnant with my daughter Emma, smiling despite the morning sickness that plagued me throughout that pregnancy. Beside me stands Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the elderly midwife who became my mentor, my surrogate mother, and the closest thing to family I'd known since that devastating day in 2001. My assistant, Rebecca, knocks softly before entering. The Riverside Medical Board is here for the 10 a.m. meeting. They're waiting in conference room A. I nod, smoothing my navy blazer as I gather the files that chronicled 23 years of building something extraordinary from the ashes of abandonment. The elevator ride to the 20th floor feels eternal, each floor marking another year of struggle, another milestone achieved without my biological family's support or acknowledgement. Conference room A stretches before me like a battleground, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Portland's skyline. 8 figures sit around the oval table, their expensive suits and practiced smiles a stark contrast to the desperation I know brought them here. At the head of the table sits a man I recognize from newspaper articles, but haven't seen in person for over 2 decades. My father, William Chen, looking every bit the pharmaceutical executive he's always been, his black hair now silver at the temples. Beside him, my mother, Linda Chen, adjusts her pearl necklace with manicured fingers that once pointed toward the door when I begged them to let me stay. Her face has been expertly maintained by what I assume are regular cosmetic procedures, but her eyes carry the same cold calculation I remember from my teenage years. Victoria, my father says, rising from his chair as if we're old friends meeting for lunch rather than estranged family members forced together by financial desperation. You look wonderful, successful. His smile doesn't reach his eyes as he gestures toward an empty chair. Please sit. We have much to discuss. I remain standing, my hands steady as I place my leather portfolio on the table. Mr. Chen, Mrs. Chen, I address them formally, as watching as my mother's face tighten at the distant greeting. I understand Riverside Medical is experiencing significant financial difficulties. The tension in the room shifts palpably. Dr. James Morrison, Riverside's chief of staff, clears his throat nervously. Victoria, perhaps we should focus on the potential partnership opportunities rather than dwelling on past difficulties. A laugh escapes before I can stop it, sharp and bitter in the polished conference room. Past difficulties? I repeat, my voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. Is that what we're calling it? My mother leans forward, her voice taking on the honeyed tone I remember from my childhood, the one she used when she wanted something. Darling, we know there were misunderstandings years ago, but family is family. We're here because we believe in what you've built, and we think there's an opportunity for all of us to benefit. The word misunderstandings hangs in the air like smoke from a fire that never quite went out. I open my portfolio, removing a single photograph that I've carried with me for 23 years. It shows me at 17, 8 months pregnant with my daughter, standing on the front steps of my childhood home in Lake Oswego, with 2 suitcases and a garbage bag full of clothes. This was taken the day you threw me out, December 15th, 2001. I was 8 months pregnant with your granddaughter, and you told me I was an embarrassment to the Chen family name. My father's composure falters slightly as he stares at the image. Victoria, you were 17 and unmarried. We were concerned about your future, about the family's reputation in the medical community. You were concerned about your pharmaceutical contracts, I correct, my voice gaining strength with each word, about what your colleagues would think, about how an unwed teenage daughter might affect your standing at the country club. Dr. Morrison attempts to redirect the conversation. Perhaps we could focus on the present situation. Riverside Medical serves over 300,000 patients annually across our 12 facilities. The potential for synergy with your birthing centers is enormous. I turn my attention to him, noting how he avoids meeting my eyes directly. Dr. Morrison, you've been with Riverside for 15 years. Tell me, in all that time, have my parents ever mentioned having a daughter? The silence that follows answers my question more eloquently than words ever could. My mother's face flushes red beneath her carefully applied makeup, and my father's jaw tightens as he realizes the extent to which they've erased me from their lives. The point is, my father says, attempting to regain control of the meeting, we're family. Blood is thicker than water, Victoria. We made mistakes, yes, but we're here now, ready to make things right. I close my portfolio with a soft click that seems to echo through the room. You want to know about blood, Mr. Chen? Let me tell you about blood. I bled alone on the bathroom floor of a shelter when I went into premature labor at 8 months because the stress of being homeless triggered early contractions. I bled through my fingers while working double shifts as a hospital janitor to pay for nursing school. I bled during my second pregnancy when I had no one to drive me to appointments because I was building my first clinic from nothing. The color drains from my mother's face as I continue. Blood is what I shed building Helena's Haven, the network of birthing centers that has safely delivered over 50,000 babies in the past 20 years. Blood is what I gave when I worked 70-hour weeks to expand into maternity hospitals. Blood is what your granddaughter Emma inherited when she started medical school last year, determined to continue the work I began. I stand, smoothing my skirt as I prepare to leave. You want to know about family? Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who died 3 years ago, was more family to me than either of you ever were. She taught me that family isn't about genetics. It's about showing up when someone needs you most. My father's desperation becomes palpable as he realizes I'm preparing to leave. Victoria, wait! Riverside Medical Center employs over 2,000 people. If we go under, thousands of families will be affected. Surely you don't want that in your conscience. I pause at the door, my hand on the brushed steel handle. My conscience is clear, Mr. Chen. I've spent 23 years helping families bring life into this world safely and with dignity. I have provided jobs, healthcare, and hope to communities that needed all three. My conscience is perfectly clear. What do you want from us? My mother asks, her voice cracking for the first time since I entered the room. What will it take? I turn back to them, seeing not the powerful medical executives they've always been, but 2 aging people who gambled everything on pride and reputation and lost the only thing that truly mattered. I want you to understand what you threw away when you chose your image over your child.
I want you to live with the knowledge that everything I accomplished, every life I've saved, every innovation I've brought to maternal health care happened without you. Not despite you, without you. The elevator doors closed behind me with a soft whisper, carrying me away from the conference room where 8 people sit in stunned silence. As I descend toward my office, I think about the scared 17-year-old girl who stood on their doorstep 23 years ago, begging for compassion and finding only coldness. That girl is gone, replaced by a woman who built an empire on the very thing her parents claimed would destroy her, the ability to nurture and protect new life. My phone buzzes with a text from Emma. "How did the meeting go, Mom? Still proud to be your daughter, no matter what those people want?" I smile for the first time all morning, typing back, "Just reminded myself why I never needed them in the first place. Love you too, sweetheart." The irony isn't lost on me as I return to my office overlooking the city I've helped reshape with maternal healthcare facilities. The family that cast me out for bringing life into the world now needs the empire I built around that very mission. But this story is far from over, and they have no idea what they've truly unleashed by walking back into my life after 23 years of silence. The afternoon light filters through my office windows as I settle into my leather chair, the weight of the morning's confrontation still heavy on my shoulders. My fingers trace the edge of a worn manila folder I keep in my desk's bottom drawer, labeled simply "The Beginning," in my own handwriting from decades ago. Inside lie the remnants of a life I built from absolute nothing, documents that chart a journey no 17-year-old should have to take alone. December 15th, 2001. The date is burned into my memory like a brand. I can still feel the icy Portland wind cutting through my thin maternity coat as I stood on the circular driveway of our Lake Oswego mansion, watching my mother's Mercedes disappear around the corner. The house behind me, with its perfectly manicured gardens and marble columns, had been my prison for 8 months as my pregnancy became increasingly impossible to hide. The pregnancy itself had been a shock. David Martinez, my boyfriend for 2 years, was a senior at Oregon State studying engineering. We had plans: college, careers, marriage eventually. But when I told him about the baby during winter break, his face went white as snow. "You need to handle this," he'd said, backing toward his car. "I can't throw my future away for a mistake." I never saw him again.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. My parents' reaction was swift and brutal. My father, Dr. William Chen, had built his reputation as one of Portland's most respected pharmaceutical executives. My mother, Linda, was the perfect society wife, serving on charity boards and hosting elegant fundraisers for various medical causes. Their daughter's teenage pregnancy didn't fit the carefully crafted image they'd spent decades building. "You've made your choice," my father had said that December morning, his voice cold as winter rain. "Now live with the consequences. The Chen family will not be dragged down by your irresponsibility." My mother hadn't even looked at me as she handed me an envelope containing $300 and a bus voucher. "You're 18 in 6 months," she'd said, adjusting her diamond bracelet with practiced indifference. "Find somewhere to be until then." What they didn't know was that I'd been listening from the top of the stairs 2 weeks earlier when they discussed their Victoria problem with their attorney. They'd considered forced adoption, boarding schools in other states, even suggested I take care of it, despite being 7 months along. The final decision was simpler: complete disownment. As far as Portland society was concerned, William and Linda Chen had no daughter. The Salvation Army shelter on Southeast Division Street became my first real home. The building, a converted warehouse with fluorescent lighting and thin mattresses, housed 40 women and children in various states of crisis. I shared a room with Maria Santos, a 28-year-old mother of 3 whose husband had been deported, and Jennifer Walsh, a 19-year-old drug addict trying to get clean for her unborn baby. Sister Catherine Murphy ran the shelter with an iron fist, wrapped in genuine compassion.
A former Army nurse in her 60s, she took one look at my expensive maternity clothes and designer purse and knew immediately I wasn't like her usual residents. "Rich girl problems," she muttered, then spent the next 2 hours teaching me how to apply for emergency welfare, Medicaid, and food stamps. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents, who made millions from healthcare, had abandoned their pregnant daughter to the very social services they often criticized at their dinner parties. But Sister Catherine didn't care about irony. She cared about keeping me and my baby alive. The shelter's rules were strict. Everyone worked if they were able. Since I was 8 months pregnant, my job options were limited, but Sister Catherine found me work in the shelter's kitchen, preparing meals for the other residents. It was there, peeling potatoes and serving soup, that I met Dr. Patricia Hernandez. Dr. Hernandez volunteered at the shelter twice a week, providing free medical care to women who couldn't afford it elsewhere. She was 72, had been a midwife for over 40 years, and possessed the kind of quiet wisdom that comes from helping thousands of women through the most transformative experience of their lives. Her weathered hands had delivered babies in hospitals, homes, and everything in between. "Let me guess," she said during my first prenatal checkup in the shelter's makeshift clinic, "your family doesn't approve of your condition." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "Well, their loss," she said matter-of-factly, listening to my baby's heartbeat with an ancient stethoscope. "This little one's strong. Takes after her mother, I'd guess." Dr. Hernandez was right. Emma was born on January 23, 2002, after 12 hours of labor in the charity ward at Legacy Emmanuel Medical Center. Dr. Hernandez stayed with me the entire time, holding my hand through contractions and whispering encouragement when I wanted to give up. When Emma finally arrived, pink and screaming and perfect, Dr. Hernandez placed her on my chest and said the words that would change everything. "She's going to need a mother who's stronger than her circumstances." Recovery was brutal. The shelter had a 2-week limit for new mothers, after which we had to find other arrangements. Dr. Hernandez offered me a deal that seemed impossible at the time. I could live in the small apartment above her private practice in exchange for helping with administrative work and basic patient care. She would teach me about midwifery while I earned my GED and figured out my next steps. "But I don't know anything about medicine," I protested, Emma sleeping in my arms. "You know about being scared, alone, and pregnant. That's 90% of what these women need, someone who understands." The apartment was tiny. 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, and a bathroom that leaked when it rained. But it was ours. Emma and I slept on a donated futon, surrounded by boxes of medical supplies and the constant sounds of women in labor from the clinic below. Dr. Hernandez's practice served primarily low-income women, immigrants, and teenagers whose families had abandoned them, just like mine had. I threw myself into learning everything I could. During Emma's naps, I studied anatomy textbooks Dr. Hernandez brought me. I learned to take blood pressure, monitor fetal heart rates, and, most importantly, how to talk to frightened women who felt like their world was ending. Many of them were barely older than I was, facing the same kind of rejection and judgment that I'd experienced. By Emma's first birthday, I was handling most of the clinic's administrative work and had begun assisting with births. Dr. Hernandez was teaching me the art of midwifery, not just the medical aspects, but the emotional support that made the difference between a traumatic experience and an empowering one.
"Birth is the most vulnerable moment in a woman's life," she often said. "How we treat her in that moment shapes not just her experience, but her relationship with her own power." When Emma turned 2, I enrolled in Portland Community College's nursing program, taking classes at night while working at the clinic during the day. Dr. Hernandez watched Emma during my evening classes, often letting her sleep in the clinic's recovery room while I studied in the break room between patients. The other nursing students came from traditional backgrounds, supportive families, college funds, clear career paths. I was 20, a single mother living above a midwifery clinic, studying by the light of my phone when Emma wouldn't sleep. But I had something they didn't: absolute determination born from having no safety net, no backup plan, no family to catch me if I fell. My clinical rotations exposed me to the stark differences in maternal care across economic lines. At OHSU, wealthy patients received private rooms, personalized birth plans, and immediate access to specialists. At the county hospital, women labored in overcrowded wards, often delivering babies they couldn't afford to raise in conditions that prioritized efficiency over dignity. It was during a particularly difficult shift at the county hospital that I witnessed something that would shape my entire future. A 19-year-old named Carmen Rodriguez had been in labor for 18 hours with her first baby. She spoke little English, had no family present, and was terrified. The overworked staff treated her as just another case number, checking her cervix roughly and speaking over her as if she wasn't there. When complications arose and Carmen needed an emergency C-section, I watched her panic turn to absolute terror as they wheeled her away from the only familiar face in the room, me. I followed her to the surgical suite, holding her hand and translating for the surgical team. Her daughter was born healthy, but Carmen's experience had been needlessly traumatic. "There has to be a better way," I told Dr. Hernandez later that night. "There is. Someone just has to build it." That conversation planted the seed that would eventually become Helena's Haven, named after Emma's middle name and my vision of a safe harbor for women during the most important moment of their lives. But building that vision would require resources I didn't have, education I hadn't yet obtained, and courage I wasn't sure I possessed. When Emma was 4, Dr. Hernandez was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis that made the physical demands of midwifery increasingly difficult. Rather than retire, she made me an offer that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. She wanted to sell me her practice. Not immediately, but eventually, when I'd finished my nursing degree and obtained my midwifery certification. "I've been doing this for 45 years, she said, her gnarled hands still gentle as they examined a pregnant teenager that reminded me of myself. "I need someone to carry on what we've built here, someone who understands what it means to be abandoned by the people who should love you most." The financial arrangements were complex. Dr. Hernandez would carry the loan herself, allowing me to take over the practice gradually while continuing my education. It would take years, require sacrifices I could barely imagine, and there was no guarantee of success. But for the first time since that December day when my parents threw me out, I had a clear vision of my future. That night, I tucked Emma into her bed in our tiny apartment and looked out the window at the Portland skyline. Somewhere out there, my parents were living their perfect life in their perfect house, probably telling people they had no children. They had no idea that their discarded daughter was planning to build something that would eventually dwarf everything they'd ever accomplished. But first, I had to survive nursing school, pass my midwifery boards, and prove that a scared teenager could become someone worthy of carrying on the legacy of Dr. Hernandez. The real work was just beginning. 2 days after the disastrous board meeting, I'm reviewing quarterly reports in my office when my private investigator, Sarah Mitchell, arrives with a thick folder that will reveal just how desperate my parents have become. Sarah, a former FBI agent turned corporate security specialist, has been quietly gathering intelligence on Riverside Medical Center since their buyout request first surfaced. "Victoria, what I found goes deeper than simple financial trouble," Sarah says, spreading documents across my conference table. "Your parents haven't just mismanaged their business, they've been systematically looting it for years." The first document shows Riverside Medical's actual financial position. What the board presented as temporary cash flow problems is actually a complete fiscal catastrophe. The hospital chain owes $340 million to various creditors, has defaulted on equipment leases worth $80 million, and faces 18 pending malpractice lawsuits with potential damages exceeding $150 million. How did they hide losses this massive? I ask, studying the forensic accounting reports. Sarah points to a series of offshore shell companies. Creative accounting. Your father's been moving money through these entities for the past 8 years. Bermuda Holdings, Cayman Medical Investments, Swiss Healthcare Partners, all ultimately controlled by William and Linda Chen personally. The pattern becomes clear as Sarah walks me through the evidence. While Riverside Medical struggled with aging equipment and understaffed facilities, my parents were siphoning millions into their personal accounts. The Lake Oswego mansion was just the beginning. They owned vacation homes in Aspen, Martha's Vineyard, and Monaco, all purchased with money that should have gone to patient care. There's more, Sarah continues, opening a second folder. Dr. James Morrison, their chief of staff, he's been receiving kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies for unnecessary drug trials conducted on maternity patients. Some of these women never gave informed consent. My blood runs cold as I read the medical records. Pregnant women at Riverside were unknowingly enrolled in experimental drug trials, their babies used as test subjects for medications that hadn't been approved for use during pregnancy. The pharmaceutical companies paid Riverside substantial fees for each patient enrolled, money that never appeared in the hospital's official books. They've been experimenting on pregnant women and their babies? I whisper, my hands shaking as I flip through case files. 47 documented cases over the past 3 years. The women thought they were receiving standard prenatal vitamins. Instead, they were getting experimental hormone treatments that caused premature labor in 15% of cases. Among the files is a photograph that makes my stomach lurch. It shows a baby born at 28 weeks, connected to tubes and machines in Riverside's NICU. The infant's mother, Rosa Gutierrez, was a 19-year-old undocumented immigrant who couldn't read the English consent forms she'd signed. She thought she was agreeing to routine prenatal care. Instead, she became subject 23 in a pharmaceutical trial for synthetic hormones. Rosa's baby spent 4 months in intensive care. The medical bills exceeded $800,000. Since she had no insurance and couldn't speak English well enough to understand what had happened, the hospital wrote off the costs as charity care and used it for tax deductions. I closed the file, my mind reeling. My parents had always been ambitious, focused on wealth and status above all else, but this level of corruption, this willingness to sacrifice vulnerable women and children for profit, represents something far darker than I had imagined. There's more, Sarah continues, opening a second folder. Dr. James Morrison, their chief of staff, he's been receiving kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies for unnecessary drug trials conducted on maternity patients. Some of these women never gave informed consent. They've been experimenting on pregnant women and their babies? I whisper, my hands shaking as I flip through case files. 47 documented cases over the past 3 years. The women thought they were receiving standard prenatal vitamins. Instead, they were getting experimental hormone treatments that caused premature labor in 15% of cases. Among the files is a photograph that makes my stomach lurch. It shows a baby born at 28 weeks connected to tubes and machines in Riverside's NICU. The infant's mother, Rosa Gutierrez, was a 19-year-old undocumented immigrant who couldn't read the English consent forms she'd signed. She thought she was agreeing to routine prenatal care. Instead, she became subject 23 in a pharmaceutical trial for synthetic hormones. Rosa's baby spent 4 months in intensive care. The medical bills exceeded $800,000. Since she had no insurance and couldn't speak English well enough to understand what had happened, the hospital wrote off the costs as charity care and used it for tax deductions. I closed the file, my mind reeling. My parents had always been ambitious, focused on wealth and status above all else, but this level of corruption, this willingness to sacrifice vulnerable women and children for profit, represents something far darker than I had imagined. There's a pattern here, Sarah continues, showing me a timeline. The experimental drug trials began in 2019, right around the time Riverside started experiencing serious financial pressure. Your parents needed revenue streams that wouldn't appear in official reports, so they partnered with pharmaceutical companies willing to pay premium rates for access to pregnant patients. The pharmaceutical companies involved read like a who's who of the industry. Meridian Biotech, Atlantic Therapeutics, Genesis Pharmaceuticals. Each had paid Riverside between $50,000 and $100,000 per patient enrolled in their trials, with bonuses for meeting enrollment targets ahead of schedule.
How did they target their victims? I asked, though I already suspect the answer. Low-income women, primarily immigrants, teens without family support, and women with limited English proficiency. Essentially, they prey on the same demographic you've spent your career protecting. The cruelest irony hits me like a physical blow. While I was building birthing centers designed to give vulnerable women dignity and choice during pregnancy, my parents were running a medical facility that systematically exploited women in identical circumstances. They had weaponized pregnancy against the powerless, while I dedicated my life to empowering them. Sarah opens a third folder containing internal communications between my parents and the pharmaceutical companies. The emails revealed the calculating coldness behind their operation. One exchange between my mother and a Meridian biotech executive discusses recruitment strategies. Linda, we need to increase enrollment by 30% this quarter. Can you target the clinic's prenatal classes for Spanish-speaking patients? They're less likely to ask detailed questions about the protocols. My mother's response chills me to the bone. Already implementing. Our intake forms now include questions about family support systems. Women without involved partners or family members are flagged as priority candidates. Another email chain shows my father negotiating bonus payments for exceeding enrollment targets. William, the Genesis hormone trial needs 12 more subjects by month end. Standard rate plus 25% bonus for early completion. My father's reply, consider it done. We have several teenage patients who fit the profile. They had turned pregnancy into a profit center, viewing vulnerable women not as patients deserving care, but as inventory for pharmaceutical experiments. The teenage patients my father mentioned, girls like I had been, scared and alone, became research subjects without understanding the risks to themselves or their babies. The pharmaceutical companies knew exactly what they were buying. Sarah explains, showing me another document. This is an internal Meridian memo describing Riverside as an ideal testing environment due to limited patient advocacy and minimal family involvement in care decisions. The systematic nature of their operation becomes clearer as Sarah reveals more evidence. Riverside had modified their intake procedures to identify vulnerable patients, created separate consent forms that buried crucial information in medical jargon, and even hired staff specifically to target women who couldn't advocate for themselves.
Dr. Morrison's role was particularly sinister. As chief of staff, he personally selected patients for enrollment, often overriding other doctors' recommendations for standard care. Several nurses had raised concerns about the experimental protocols, only to be transferred to other departments or terminated for performance issues. 3 nurses filed whistleblower complaints with the state medical board, Sarah tells me. All 3 complaints mysteriously disappeared from the official records. 2 of the nurses left Oregon entirely after receiving anonymous threats. I study photographs of the departed nurses, Maria Santos, Jennifer Walsh, and Catherine Murphy. Their names trigger a memory that makes my hands tremble. These were the same names as the women who had shared the shelter with me 23 years ago, the women who had shown me kindness when my own family abandoned me. Sarah, I need you to find these nurses immediately, I say, my voice urgent. I think my parents deliberately targeted them because of their connection to me. The investigation into the missing nurses reveals another layer of my parents' vindictive nature. Through hospital employment records, they had discovered that all 3 women had worked at the Salvation Army shelter, where I lived after being thrown out. My parents had hired them specifically to monitor my activities and gather information about my growing business. Maria Santos, the former shelter resident who had shared a room with me, had been working as a nurse at Riverside for 5 years before questioning the experimental protocols. When she tried to report the unauthorized drug trials, she discovered that her own medical records from 20 years ago, including documentation of her husband's deportation, had somehow found their way into her personnel file as leverage against speaking out. Your parents have been watching you for decades, Sarah concludes. Every employee they hired, every business decision they made, every partnership they formed, it was all designed to eventually undermine your success or gather intelligence about your operations.
The final piece of evidence Sarah presents is the most disturbing. Hidden in Riverside's computer system, she found a folder labeled Victoria Project, containing detailed financial analyses of Helena's Haven, copies of our marketing materials, and even architectural plans of our newest facilities. They've been planning this buyout attempt for at least 3 years, Sarah explains. The experimental drug trials, the financial mismanagement, even the recent acceleration of their spending, it was all designed to create a crisis that would force you to bail them out and stave the very institution they'd corrupted. They never intended to run Riverside legitimately, I realize aloud. They've been using it as a weapon against me while looting it for their personal gain. Sarah nods grimly. And now that they've extracted everything of value, they want to dump the liability on you and walk away with both your business and their freedom. But what my parents don't understand is that their 23-year campaign of surveillance and sabotage has given me something they never expected: a complete roadmap of their crimes and a network of witnesses ready to testify against them. The very people they'd silenced and threatened are now my greatest allies in bringing their medical empire crashing down. The war they started when they threw a pregnant teenager onto the street is about to end, but not the way they planned. The secure conference room on the 42nd floor of downtown Portland's Pearson Associates law firm buzzes with controlled urgency as I survey the team assembled around the mahogany table. It's been 1 week since Sarah's bombshell revelations about my parents' corruption, and now 12 of the most respected professionals in Oregon sit ready to help me bring down the medical empire built on exploitation. Attorney General Lisa Hawthorne leads the prosecution team, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matches her no-nonsense demeanor. Beside her sits Detective Michael Rodriguez from the Portland Police Bureau's White-Collar Crime Division, surrounded by boxes of evidence that represent thousands of hours of investigation. Dr. Angela Foster, Oregon's Director of Medical Ethics, reviews patient files with barely contained fury, while FBI Special Agent Thomas Chen, no relation to my parents despite the surname, coordinates with federal authorities on the pharmaceutical conspiracy charges. Victoria, what you've uncovered represents the largest medical fraud case in Oregon history, Attorney General Hawthorne begins, her voice steady but her eyes burning with indignation. We're looking at federal racketeering charges, medical malpractice on an unprecedented scale, and systematic violation of informed consent laws. The evidence Sarah gathered has been meticulously organized into prosecution-ready files. Detective Rodriguez opens the first box, revealing medical records from 47 women who were unknowingly enrolled in pharmaceutical trials at Riverside. Each file tells a story of trust betrayed and lives forever altered by my parents' greed. We've located 31 of the affected patients, Detective Rodriguez reports. All are willing to testify. Several have suffered long-term health consequences from the experimental treatments, and 6 babies required extended NICU stays due to drug-induced complications.
Dr. Foster slides a thick medical journal across the table. I've been reviewing the pharmaceutical protocols your parents approved. None of these experimental treatments had FDA approval for use in pregnant women. The companies involved were conducting illegal Phase 2 trials using Riverside patients as unwitting test subjects. The scope of the conspiracy extends far beyond what I initially imagined. Special Agent Chen reveals that similar operations were running in 12 other hospitals across 6 states, all coordinated by the same pharmaceutical companies that partnered with my parents. Riverside Medical wasn't just a local corruption case, it was the regional hub of a national network exploiting pregnant women for profit. The pharmaceutical companies involved have been under federal surveillance for 18 months, Agent Chen explains. Your parents' operation was actually the largest single provider of test subjects in their network. They were receiving premium payments because they could guarantee enrollment numbers other hospitals couldn't match. My phone vibrates with an incoming call from Emma, now a second-year medical student at Oregon Health and Science University. I step away from the table to answer, needing to hear my daughter's voice amid the darkness of my parents' crimes. Mom, I've been researching the drug trials at Riverside.
Emma's voice carries the righteous anger I recognize from my own younger self. My professors are horrified. Dr. Martinez wants to know if you need expert witnesses for the medical malpractice components. Tell Dr. Martinez yes, I reply, pride swelling in my chest despite the circumstances. And Emma, thank you for using your medical education to help right these wrongs. When I return to the table, the team has moved on to discussing the financial crimes. Forensic accountant Rebecca Walsh spreads out charts showing the complex web of offshore accounts my parents used to hide their stolen millions. The money trail is extensive but trackable, Walsh explains. William and Linda Chen moved approximately $180 million through 17 shell companies over 8 years. They were incredibly sophisticated in their laundering techniques, but they made one crucial mistake. The mistake, it turns out, was using the same law firm to set up their offshore entities that they'd used for legitimate business purposes 20 years earlier. The firm's records provided a complete roadmap of every financial transaction, every property purchase, and every attempt to hide assets from Riverside's creditors. We can recover approximately 70% of the stolen funds, Walsh continues. The rest was spent on luxury items and properties that have depreciated or been sold, but the recoverable amount should be sufficient to settle most of Riverside's legitimate debts and provide restitution to the affected patients. Dr. Patricia Hernandez would have been proud to see this moment, I think, as the prosecution team outlines their strategy. Her dedication to protecting vulnerable women had inspired my life's work, and now that same mission was bringing justice to women my parents had exploited. The door opens, and my assistant Rebecca enters with 3 people I recognize immediately. The nurses who had tried to blow the whistle on Riverside's illegal activities. Maria Santos, Jennifer Walsh, and Catherine Murphy look nervous but determined as they take seats at the expanded conference table. Maria, now 51 with gray threading through her dark hair, speaks first. Miss Chen, we want you to know that we never forgot your kindness at the shelter 23 years ago. When your parents hired us, we thought it was a coincidence. We didn't realize until much later that they were using us to spy on your business. Jennifer, still fighting to stay clean after decades of addiction struggles, adds her testimony. They promised me steady work and good benefits if I reported back about your operations. When I refused to compromise patient care for their drug trials, they threatened to expose my history to your licensing board. Catherine, whose strong voice carried the same authority I remembered from the shelter, delivers the most damning revelation. Your parents kept files on every patient who had any connection to you or your staff. They were building profiles to use as leverage. When we tried to report the illegal drug trials, they reminded us that our own medical records somehow found their way into their possession. Attorney General Hawthorne leans forward intently. Are you willing to testify about these intimidation tactics? All 3 women nod without hesitation. These women trusted us to care for them during pregnancy, Maria said firmly. Your parents turned that trust into a weapon. We won't let them get away with it. The next revelation comes from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Hernandez's former attorney, Alan Pierce, arrives with a wooden box I've never seen before. Inside are letters Dr. Hernandez had written but never sent, documenting her growing suspicions about my parents' activities during the final years of her life. Patricia asked me to give these to you if anything ever happened to expose your parents' true nature, Alan explains as I lift the letters with trembling hands. She'd been investigating them quietly for 5 years before her death. Dr. Hernandez's spidery handwriting fills page after page with observations that prove she understood the threat my parents posed long before I did. One letter, dated just 6 months before her death, contains a chilling prediction.
My dearest Victoria, I fear your parents view your success not with pride, but with envy and calculation. They've been asking too many questions about your business practices, your financial arrangements, and your patient demographics. William called my office 3 times this month asking about your methods for treating vulnerable populations. I believe they're planning something that will put your life's work at risk. Trust no one from their organization, and remember that the truth always has more power than money or influence. The final letter, written just weeks before Dr. Hernandez passed away, contains specific instructions for exposing my parents' corruption. I've documented evidence of medical malpractice at Riverside that involves pharmaceutical testing on pregnant patients. The evidence is in a safety deposit box at First National Bank, box number 847. Victoria holds the key. I gave it to her when she graduated nursing school, disguised as my grandmother's locket. She doesn't know its true purpose yet, but when the time comes, she'll understand. My hand instinctively moves to the silver locket hanging beneath my blouse, a gift from Dr. Hernandez that I've worn every day for 15 years. Inside the locket, behind the tiny photographs of Emma and Dr. Hernandez, is a small silver key I'd assumed was decorative. An hour later, we're standing in the vault of First National Bank as I insert Dr. Hernandez's key into safety deposit box 847. Inside are medical records, photographs, recorded conversations, and financial documents that provide even more evidence of my parents' systematic corruption. "She was protecting you even after death," Attorney General Hawthorne observes as we review Dr. Hernandez's meticulously organized evidence. "This woman understood that your parents would eventually try to destroy everything you'd built." Among Dr. Hernandez's files is a recording she made of a phone conversation with my father from 2 years ago. His voice, captured on a small digital recorder, discusses plans to acquire Victoria's operation through strategic pressure and eliminate the competition she represents to legitimate medical practice. The recording proves that my parents' current financial crisis wasn't accidental mismanagement. It was a calculated strategy to force a buyout of my business while simultaneously destroying my reputation in the medical community. Dr. Foster reviews the medical evidence with growing outrage. Dr. Hernandez documented patterns of unnecessary interventions, experimental procedures without consent, and systematic targeting of vulnerable patients. This evidence corroborates everything we found in our current investigation. As the afternoon progresses, our team grows stronger with each new piece of evidence and every ally who steps forward. FBI Special Agent Chen receives confirmation that federal warrants have been approved for my parents' arrest, while Detective Rodriguez coordinates with state authorities to freeze all their known assets. The pharmaceutical companies are cooperating fully, Agent Chen reports. They're providing complete records of their payments to Riverside in exchange for reduced charges. Your parents were the architects of this conspiracy. The companies were, essentially, their clients. Attorney General Hawthorne closes her briefcase with satisfaction. "We have enough evidence to prosecute successfully, and we have the resources to ensure justice for every affected patient. Your parents built their fortune on the suffering of vulnerable women, but their victims are about to become their downfall." As the legal team disperses to prepare for the coordinated arrests and prosecutions, I remain in the bank vault holding Dr. Hernandez's final letter. Her words, written in the knowledge that she wouldn't live to see justice served, provide both comfort and determination. "Victoria, if you're reading this, then the battle I couldn't fight is now yours to win. You have always been stronger than your circumstances, more compassionate than those who abandoned you, and more determined than those who seek to profit from others' pain. The women who trusted you with their most vulnerable moments are counting on you to protect them from those who would exploit that vulnerability. Make them proud. Make me proud. And remember that the greatest revenge against those who abandoned you is a life lived in service to others." Tomorrow, my parents will face the consequences of 2 decades of corruption. But tonight, I'll honor Dr. Hernandez's memory by ensuring that every woman they exploited receives the justice she deserves. The Multnomah County Courthouse erupts in controlled chaos as news vans line the street and reporters jostle for position on the courthouse steps. It's 8 a.m. on a crisp October morning, and the most significant medical fraud prosecution in Oregon history is about to begin.
I adjust my navy suit jacket and touch Dr. Hernandez's silver locket at my throat, drawing strength from her memory as I prepare to face the people who threw me away 23 years ago. Inside courtroom 4A, Judge Margaret Harrison presides over a packed gallery. The Honorable Judge Harrison, known for her uncompromising stance on medical ethics violations, surveys the scene with steely determination. Behind the prosecution table, Attorney General Lisa Hawthorne arranges mountains of evidence, while FBI Special Agent Thomas Chen coordinates with federal prosecutors who flew in from Washington, D.C. specifically for this case. My parents enter through the side door, flanked by their high-powered legal team. Harrison Wells III, grandson of the original Harrison Wells who once represented Portland's elite, leads their defense. Beside him, criminal attorney Sandra Mitchell, no relation to my investigator, Sarah, specializes in defending wealthy defendants facing federal charges. The irony isn't lost on me that my parents, who once claimed poverty forced them to abandon me, can now afford legal representation that costs more per hour than most people earn in a month. William Chen has aged dramatically since our board meeting. His usually perfect hair shows gray roots, and his expensive suit hangs loosely on a frame that's lost 20 pounds from stress. Linda Chen sits rigidly beside him, her designer armor intact, but her eyes darting nervously around the courtroom, filled with former patients, whistleblower nurses, and medical professionals who once respected the Chen family name.
Your Honor, Attorney General Hawthorne begins, rising from her seat with the confidence of someone holding an unbeatable hand. The state will prove that the defendants operated a criminal enterprise that systematically exploited pregnant women for financial gain, endangering both mothers and babies through unauthorized medical experimentation. The prosecution's opening statement methodically outlines the scope of my parents' crimes. Hawthorne presents evidence of 47 documented victims, $180 million in embezzled funds, and a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of pharmaceutical research. Charts and graphs on large screens show the money trail from pharmaceutical companies through shell corporations to my parents' personal accounts. The defendants didn't simply mismanage a hospital, Hawthorne continues, her voice rising with controlled indignation. They weaponized pregnancy itself, turning the most vulnerable moment in a woman's life into a profit opportunity. They preyed on teenagers, immigrants, and low-income women who trusted them with their lives and the lives of their unborn children. Harrison Wells III rises for the defense with practiced smoothness. His strategy becomes immediately clear. Blame others while portraying my parents as naive administrators who trusted corrupt subordinates. Your Honor, my clients are respected members of Portland's medical community who built Riverside Medical Center to serve those in need. Any irregularities in patient care were the result of rogue employees acting without authorization. The defense strategy crumbles within hours as the prosecution presents recorded conversations between my parents and pharmaceutical executives. Agent Chen operates the audio equipment as my father's voice fills the courtroom. We can guarantee 30 subjects per month for the hormone trials. These women don't ask questions. They're just grateful for free prenatal care. My mother's voice follows, discussing patient selection criteria with a chilling calculation. Target the teenage mothers and the ones who don't speak English well. They're less likely to understand what they're signing, and they have no family members asking difficult questions. The gallery stirs uneasily as the recordings play. Several former patients wipe away tears while their husbands and partners show visible anger at hearing how their families were discussed as commodity inventory. The first witness called is Dr. Angela Foster, Oregon's Director of Medical Ethics, whose testimony establishes the standard of care my parents violated. Dr. Foster, a respected physician with 30 years of experience, explains informed consent requirements and the ethical obligations medical professionals have toward pregnant patients.
Experimental drug trials require extensive disclosure and patient education, Dr. Foster testifies, her voice clear and authoritative. Patients must understand the risks to themselves and their babies, have the opportunity to ask questions, and give consent in their native language. None of these requirements were met at Riverside Medical Center. The defense attempts to discredit Dr. Foster by suggesting she's biased against private healthcare facilities, but her credentials and reputation proved unassailable. Judge Harrison sustains every prosecution objection while overruling the defense's increasingly desperate attempts to undermine expert testimony. Maria Santos takes the witness stand next, her hands trembling slightly as she's sworn in. Over the past month, Maria has found her voice again, and her testimony devastates the defense's claims of innocence. Dr. Chen personally selected patients for the experimental treatments, she testifies, her accent thick with emotion. He told us to identify women who were compliant and unlikely to cause problems. The prosecution presents Maria's contemporaneous notes documenting my father's instructions to target vulnerable patients. Her nursing logs show how the hospital's intake procedures were modified to flag women without strong family support systems or adequate English skills. Mrs. Chen reviewed our patient lists weekly, Maria continues, her voice growing stronger with each answer. She specifically asked about teenage mothers and recent immigrants. She called them ideal candidates for the research protocols. Harrison attempts to discredit Maria by bringing up her immigration status and her history at the women's shelter, but this strategy backfires spectacularly. Maria's response resonates throughout the courtroom. Yes, I was poor. Yes, I needed help. That's exactly why I understood what these women were going through. That's why I tried to protect them from people who saw their desperation as an opportunity. Jennifer Walsh follows Maria to the witness stand, her recovery from addiction making her testimony even more powerful. She describes how my parents used her past struggles as leverage to ensure her silence when she questioned the experimental protocols. They told me that if I caused problems, they would make sure everyone in the medical community knew about my history. They said I should be grateful they hired someone with my background and not jeopardize the opportunity by asking too many questions. The defense's cross-examination of Jennifer becomes ugly quickly, with Sandra Mitchell attempting to portray her as an unreliable witness due to her addiction history. Judge Harrison intervenes when the questioning becomes abusive, and Jennifer's composed responses only strengthen her credibility. My addiction doesn't change what I saw. It doesn't change the fact that women trusted us to care for them, and we participated in experimenting on their babies without their knowledge. Catherine Murphy's testimony provides the final blow to the defense's strategy. As the most experienced nurse among the whistleblowers, her detailed knowledge of medical protocols and patient care standards exposes every aspect of my parents' conspiracy.
Dr. Chen instructed us to use simplified consent forms that buried crucial information and medical jargon, Catherine testifies, her voice carrying the authority of decades in healthcare. He told us that these women didn't need to understand every detail, they just needed to sign the papers. The prosecution presents evidence of Catherine's attempts to report the illegal activities through proper channels, along with documentation of how my parents systematically suppressed and destroyed her complaints. When the prosecution calls Rosa Gutierrez to testify about her experience as an unwitting test subject, the courtroom falls completely silent. Rosa, now 22, carries her 3-year-old daughter Sophia as she takes the witness stand. Sophia, born prematurely due to experimental hormone treatments, shows visible developmental delays that will affect her for life. I thought I was getting vitamins to help my baby, Rosa testifies, through a Spanish interpreter, her voice breaking as she holds Sophia closer. They told me it was standard care for all pregnant women. I trusted them because they were doctors. The medical records show that Rosa's premature labor was directly caused by the experimental hormones she received without informed consent. Sophia's 4-month NICU stay cost over $800,000, money the hospital wrote off as charity care while secretly receiving $75,000 from the pharmaceutical company for Rosa's participation in the unauthorized trial. Harrison Wells' cross-examination of Rosa becomes a disaster for the defense when he attempts to suggest she bears responsibility for not reading the consent forms more carefully. The interpreter clarifies that Rosa was functionally illiterate in both Spanish and English, making informed consent impossible regardless of the language used. Judge Harrison's expression grows increasingly stern as witness after witness exposes the systematic nature of my parents' exploitation. When the prosecution presents financial records showing that my parents personally received over $2 million in research coordination fees from pharmaceutical companies, the judge's restraint finally cracks. "Mr. Wells," Judge Harrison addresses the defense attorney, "are you seriously arguing that your clients received millions of dollars for research they claim to know nothing about?" The defense strategy collapses entirely when Agent Chen presents recordings of my parents discussing how to expand their patient recruitment to include women from my birthing centers. The recordings, made just 6 months ago, reveal plans to infiltrate Helena's Haven by posing as patients and gathering intelligence about our vulnerable client base. "We need access to Victoria's patient population," my father's voice states clearly on the recording. "Those women are perfect for our purposes, young, scared, and isolated. If we can position ourselves as a backup referral option, we can recruit dozens of new subjects." My mother's response chills the courtroom. Victoria thinks she's protecting these women, but she's actually gathering exactly the demographic we need. We just have to figure out how to access her client list. The prosecution's case concludes with testimony from pharmaceutical executives who received immunity in exchange for their cooperation. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, former research director at Meridian Biotech, explains how my parents actively marketed Riverside as a source for compliant research subjects who wouldn't question experimental protocols. The Chens guaranteed enrollment numbers that other hospitals couldn't match, Dr. Rodriguez testifies, his voice barely above a whisper. They assured us that their patient population was ideal for phase 2 trials because the women were grateful for any care and unlikely to file complaints. As the prosecution rests its case, the weight of evidence against my parents feels overwhelming. 47 victims, millions in stolen funds, recorded admissions of guilt, and testimony from respected medical professionals have painted a picture of systematic corruption that destroyed lives for profit. But the defense isn't finished yet, and Harrison Wells has one final strategy that could change everything, attacking me personally and suggesting that this entire prosecution is motivated by family revenge rather than justice. The real battle is just beginning. The courtroom atmosphere shifts dramatically as defense attorney Harrison Wells III calls his first witness, Dr. Kevin Matthews, a psychiatrist hired to provide expert testimony about family dysfunction and its impact on perception and memory. The defense's final gambit has become clear. They're going to attack my credibility by suggesting that childhood abandonment has distorted my judgment and motivated a vindictive prosecution. Dr. Matthews, a silver-haired man in his 60s with a practiced courtroom demeanor, takes the witness stand with an air of academic authority. Wells guides him through testimony designed to paint me as an unreliable narrator whose traumatic past has created an obsessive need for revenge against my parents. Abandonment trauma in adolescence often manifests as hypervigilance and paranoid ideation in adulthood. Individuals who experience parental rejection may develop an exaggerated sense of persecution and attribute malicious intent to normal business activities. The implication is clear. The defense wants the jury to believe that my parents' crimes are actually my delusions, projections of abandonment trauma onto legitimate medical practice. Wells presents financial records showing that Helena's Haven's rapid expansion and suggests that my success has been driven by unhealthy psychological motivations rather than genuine care for patients.
Ms. Chen has built her entire identity around opposing her parents' medical philosophy, Dr. Matthews continues, his voice carrying the false authority of purchased expertise. This prosecution represents the culmination of a decades-long campaign to destroy the people who, in her perception, wronged her as a teenager. Attorney General Hawthorne's objection is swift and sharp. Your Honor, this testimony is irrelevant to the criminal charges and constitutes an impermissible character assassination of a prosecution witness. Judge Harrison sustains the objection but allows the defense to continue within limits. Wells pivots to presenting an alternative narrative of my parents' actions, portraying them as loving but overwhelmed parents who made difficult decisions during a family crisis. William and Linda Chen were facing financial pressures when their teenage daughter became pregnant, Wells argues, addressing the jury directly. They arranged temporary care with a relative while they stabilized their situation. This was responsible parenting, not abandonment. The defense's rewriting of history grows more audacious, as well as presents character witnesses, former colleagues and country club friends who testified to my parents' exemplary character and dedication to family values. The testimonies feel hollow and rehearsed, but they create enough doubt to make some jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats. Sandra Mitchell takes over for the defense's closing phase, focusing on the pharmaceutical companies rather than the direct evidence against my parents. Her strategy is to portray William and Linda Chen as naive administrators who trusted corrupt corporate partners and were ultimately victimized by sophisticated pharmaceutical executives. My clients believed they were participating in legitimate medical research, Mitchell argues, her voice resonating with practiced sincerity. The pharmaceutical companies provided falsified documentation and assured the hospital administration that all protocols met FDA requirements. The defense is presenting internal Riverside memos showing that some pharmaceutical representatives did provide misleading information about their research approvals. Mitchell uses these documents to suggest that my parents were deceived rather than complicit, positioning them as victims of corporate fraud rather than architects of medical corruption. But the prosecution has been anticipating the strategy. Attorney General Hawthorne's cross-examination of Dr. Matthews exposes the financial arrangement between the defense and the psychiatrist, revealing that he was paid $75,000 to provide testimony without ever interviewing me or reviewing the actual evidence in the case. Dr. Matthews, you've testified extensively about Ms. Chen's psychological state, Hawthorne begins, her voice carrying an edge of controlled anger. When did you interview her? I based my assessment on the available documentation, Dr. Matthews stammers, realizing he's walked into a trap. So you diagnosed someone you've never met based on documents provided by the people paying your substantial fee? Hawthorne presses, her tone growing sharper with each word. The defense's psychiatric expert crumbles under scrutiny, admitting that his entire testimony was based on speculation and assumptions rather than clinical evaluation. Judge Harrison strikes his testimony from the record and instructs the jury to disregard his conclusions about my psychological state. The defense's character witnesses fare no better under cross-examination. Each person who testified to my parents' exemplary character is forced to admit they knew nothing about Riverside's medical practices, had never witnessed my parents interacting with patients, and were unaware of the experimental drug trials until reading about them in news coverage. When the defense attempts to present financial records suggesting the pharmaceutical payments were legitimate research fees, FBI Special Agent Chen produces additional evidence that demolishes this claim. The financial records show that my parents received payments for research coordination on trials that were never approved by any institutional review board and involved drugs that had never received FDA clearance for use in pregnant women. The defense weren't naive victims, Agent Chen testifies, his voice steady and authoritative. They actively solicited pharmaceutical companies to conduct unauthorized trials at their facility. These weren't legitimate research payments. They were bribes for access to vulnerable patients. The prosecution's rebuttal case introduces evidence that the defense tried to suppress, recordings of my parents discussing how to discredit me personally if their crimes were ever exposed. The recordings, made just 3 months ago when they realized federal investigators were closing in, reveal the calculated nature of their defense strategy. If Victoria tries to cause trouble, we'll expose her as an unstable woman obsessed with childhood grudges. My father's voice states clearly on the recording. Her abandonment issues make her an unreliable witness.
No jury will believe someone who spent 20 years plotting revenge. My mother's response is even more damning. We should have had her committed years ago when she started building those birthing centers. We could have used her mental health history to discredit anything she said about us.
The recordings expose the defense's strategy as premeditated character assassination rather than legitimate legal defense. Judge Harrison's expression shows barely contained disgust as the jury hears my parents discussing plans to fabricate mental health records to use against me. The prosecution calls its final witness, Emma Chen, my daughter, now a second-year medical student at Oregon Health and Science University. Emma takes the witness stand with quiet dignity, wearing her white medical student coat as a symbol of the ethical standards my parents violated. I've studied the medical records from Riverside Medical Center as part of my coursework in medical ethics, Emma testifies, her voice clear and strong. The experimental protocols violated every standard of informed consent we're taught to uphold. These weren't research studies, they were exploitation disguised as healthcare. Emma's testimony carries special weight because of her medical training and her personal connection to the case. As she explains how the experimental drug trials endangered both mothers and babies, her credibility as an objective medical professional undermines the defense's claims that this prosecution is motivated by family vengeance. My mother built Helena's Haven to protect women during pregnancy. The defendants built Riverside to exploit women during pregnancy. The evidence shows which approach actually serves patients' interests. The defense's cross-examination of Emma backfires spectacularly when Sandra Mitchell attempts to suggest that Emma's testimony is biased by loyalty to me. Emma's response resonates throughout the courtroom. My loyalty is to the Hippocratic Oath and the patients these defendants harmed. If my own grandmother had committed these crimes, I would testify against her just as clearly. As the trial moves toward closing arguments, the defense makes one final desperate attempt to shift blame. Harrison Wells presents a motion to dismiss charges against my mother, arguing that she was merely following her husband's directives and shouldn't be held responsible for decisions made by Riverside's chief executive. Judge Harrison denies the motion immediately, noting that the evidence shows Linda Chen actively participated in patient selection and received equal compensation for the illegal activities. Mrs. Chen wasn't a passive participant, the judge states firmly. She was a full partner in this criminal enterprise. Attorney General Hawthorne's closing argument methodically reviews the evidence against my parents, emphasizing the systematic nature of their crimes and the devastating impact on vulnerable women and children. She presents enlarged photographs of the babies who suffered complications from experimental drugs, their tiny faces serving as silent witnesses to the consequences of medical corruption. William and Linda Chen turned pregnancy into a profit center. They betrayed the trust placed in them by society, by their profession, and by the vulnerable women who sought their care. Justice demands that they face the full consequences of their crimes. The defense's closing argument feels hollow after the devastating evidence presented by the prosecution. Wells and Mitchell make one final attempt to portray my parents as well-intentioned professionals who made mistakes, rather than criminals who systematically exploited pregnant women for profit. But their words ring false in a courtroom where the jury has heard recordings of my parents discussing patients as inventory and witnessed testimony from dozens of women whose trust was betrayed. The evidence is overwhelming, the intent is clear, and the harm is undeniable. Judge Harrison's instructions to the jury are comprehensive and damning for the defense. She explains the legal standards for medical malpractice, informed consent violations, and racketeering charges, while emphasizing that the defendant's intent and knowledge are clearly established by their own recorded words. The jury deliberates for just 4 hours before returning with unanimous guilty verdicts on all counts. As the foreman reads guilty 47 times, once for each victim, my parents' composure finally cracks completely. Linda Chen collapses in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably, while William Chen stares straight ahead with the hollow expression of a man whose carefully constructed world has crumbled around him.
Judge Harrison schedules sentencing for 30 days later, but announces immediate asset forfeiture to ensure restitution for the victims. Federal marshals serve papers freezing all known Chen family assets, including the Lake Oswego mansion, vacation properties, and offshore accounts totaling $180 million. As court adjourns, I feel Dr. Hernandez's spirit beside me, finally at peace knowing that justice has been served for the women she spent her life protecting. The people who abandoned me for bringing life into the world have been held accountable for destroying lives in pursuit of profit. But this victory is just the beginning of the healing process for dozens of women and children whose trust was betrayed by the people who should have protected them most. 2 years have passed since Judge Harrison sentenced my parents to 15 years in federal prison, and the morning sun streams through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new office atop the Patricia Hernandez Memorial Medical Center. The building, a gleaming 12-story tower of glass and steel, rises from the exact location where Dr. Hernandez's modest clinic once stood. From my desk, I can see the entire Helena's Haven network spanning across Portland's skyline. 15 birthing centers, and 3 full-service maternity hospitals that have transformed how this city approaches maternal health care. The transformation began immediately after the trial concluded. With $127 million recovered from my parents' frozen assets, we established the Riverside Recovery Foundation, dedicated to providing free health care and legal support to the 47 women who survived my parents' illegal experiments. Every victim received full medical care for themselves and their children, along with financial compensation that acknowledged the trauma they endured while helping them build better futures.
Rosa Gutierrez sits across from my desk now, her daughter Sophia playing quietly with educational toys in the corner of my office. Sophia, now 5 years old, has overcome most of the developmental delays caused by the experimental drugs she was exposed to in utero. Through intensive therapy funded by the foundation, she's thriving in kindergarten and shows no signs of the learning disabilities doctors once feared would be permanent. Miss Chen, Rosa says, her English now fluent after 2 years of language classes funded by the foundation. I wanted to show you Sophia's latest report card before I start my new job at the hospital. Rosa graduated from Oregon Community College last month with a degree in medical administration, her education paid for entirely by the foundation. She begins work next week as a patient advocate at Helena's Haven Central, where her primary responsibility will be ensuring that immigrant women receive culturally sensitive care and fully understand their treatment options. Sophia's teacher says she's reading at a second-grade level already, I observe, reviewing the glowing report card. And you're going to be wonderful in patient advocacy. You understand better than anyone how vulnerable women feel when they don't speak the language or understand the medical system. The irony of Rosa's career path isn't lost on either of us. The woman my parents exploited because she couldn't advocate for herself has become a professional advocate for others facing similar challenges. Her transformation from victim to healer represents the broader change that emerged from the ashes of Riverside Medical Center. After Rosa and Sophia leave, I walk through the memorial garden that occupies the building's 3rd floor. Bronze plaques honor the memory of Dr. Patricia Hernandez and list the names of every woman who suffered at Riverside Medical Center. The garden serves as both memorial and promise, a commitment that their suffering was not in vain and will never be repeated. The centerpiece of the memorial is a sculpture called Protective Embrace, depicting a woman sheltering a child while reaching out to help another. The inscription, taken from Dr. Hernandez's writings, reads, "The greatest measure of a society is how it protects its most vulnerable during their most vulnerable moments." My phone buzzes with a calendar reminder for the afternoon board meeting, where we'll discuss the Helena's Haven expansion into rural Oregon. The foundation's success has attracted attention from medical schools and public health organizations worldwide, with requests to replicate our patient-centered care model in communities where vulnerable women lack access to dignified maternal health care. Dr. Michael Stevens, my new chief medical officer and former professor at OHSU, joins me in the elevator as we head to the boardroom. Dr. Stevens was one of the physicians who testified as an expert witness during my parents' trial,
and his revulsion at their crimes motivated him to leave traditional hospital administration to join our mission. Victoria, the preliminary data from our rural clinics are remarkable, he reports as we review the latest statistics. Maternal mortality rates in our service areas have dropped by 60%, and patient satisfaction scores are the highest in the state. More importantly, we're seeing women seek prenatal care earlier because they trust our approach. The boardroom fills with familiar faces as our leadership team assembles. Emma, now in her final year of medical school, serves as our student representative and brings perspectives on training the next generation of healthcare providers. Maria Santos, promoted to Director of Nursing Education, oversees training programs that emphasize patient advocacy and cultural sensitivity. Jennifer Walsh heads our addiction recovery support services, helping pregnant women struggling with substance abuse receive treatment without judgment. Catherine Murphy, our Director of Patient Safety, presents her quarterly report on ensuring that the medical exploitation my parents orchestrated never happens again at any Helena's Haven facility. We've implemented triple verification protocols for any research activities, and every consent form is reviewed by both medical and legal teams to ensure complete transparency. The transformation extends beyond our organization. Oregon's legislature passed the Riverside Medical Accountability Act, requiring independent oversight of all medical research involving pregnant women. The law mandates that consent forms be available in patients' native languages and establishes criminal penalties for healthcare providers who exploit vulnerable populations. FBI Special Agent Thomas Chen, who maintained no relation to my parents despite the shared surname, stops by after the board meeting to brief me on the continuing investigation into pharmaceutical companies that collaborated with Riverside. The federal probe has expanded to include 12 other hospitals in 6 states, with more than 200 additional victims identified. Your parents' conviction was just the beginning, Agent Chen explains. The pharmaceutical companies are facing federal racketeering charges, and we're seeing whistleblowers come forward from hospitals across the country. The Riverside case has given other victims the courage to speak up. The ripple effects continue spreading through the medical industry. 3 major pharmaceutical companies have faced criminal charges, and the FDA has implemented new oversight procedures for research involving pregnant women. Medical schools now require courses on medical ethics and vulnerable population protection, using the Riverside case as a cautionary example of how financial incentives can corrupt patient care. As evening approaches, I drive to Lake Oswego for a monthly tradition that began shortly after my parents' sentencing. The Chen family mansion, seized as part of the asset forfeiture, now serves as a transitional housing facility for pregnant women experiencing homelessness. The property that once symbolized my abandonment has been transformed into a sanctuary for women facing the same circumstances I endured 23 years ago. Sister Catherine Murphy, the former Army nurse who ran the Salvation Army shelter where I lived after being thrown out, now manages the Lake Oswego facility at age 78. Her decision to come out of retirement to run the transitional housing program represents the full circle that defines this entire journey. Victoria, we have 12 residents right now, Sister Catherine reports as we tour the facility that was once my childhood home. 3 are in their final trimester, 4 have newborns, and 5 are working toward independent housing while building job skills. The master bedroom where my parents once slept now houses Maria Gonzalez, an 18-year-old who arrived 3 months ago after her family disowned her for becoming pregnant. Maria reminds me powerfully of myself at that age, scared, alone, but determined to build a better life for her child. I want to study nursing like you did, Maria tells me during our conversation in what used to be my father's study. Sister Catherine says Helena's Haven offers scholarships for women who want to work in maternal health care. The scholarship program, funded entirely by recovered assets from my parents' crimes, has supported 43 women in pursuing healthcare careers over the past 2 years. Many of the scholarship recipients are former patients or women who experienced similar abandonment and exploitation. They're building careers dedicated to protecting other vulnerable women from the kind of trauma they survived. In the kitchen where my mother once discussed charity events over champagne, we now serve meals to women whose families rejected them for bringing life into the world. The formal dining room where my parents entertain pharmaceutical executives has been converted into a childcare center where toddlers play while their mothers attend job training sessions. The transformation feels like justice in its purest form. A place that once represented greed and abandonment now provides hope and support to the most vulnerable members of our community. Every day, women who might otherwise face homelessness during pregnancy find safety, dignity, and opportunity in the home that was once a symbol of everything cold and calculating about my family. Emma joins me for dinner at the facility. A tradition we've maintained since graduating from medical school was no longer a distant dream, but an imminent reality. "Mom, I've been thinking about the international expansion proposals," Emma says as we help serve dinner to the residents. "There are so many places where vulnerable women face the same exploitation that happened at Riverside. We have the resources and expertise to make a real difference." The international interest has been overwhelming. Delegations from healthcare organizations in 12 countries have visited Helena's Haven to study our patient-centered care model. The World Health Organization has invited me to speak at their annual conference on maternal mortality reduction, specifically addressing how to protect vulnerable women from medical exploitation. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, Emma's former professor who testified during the trial, has proposed establishing Helena's Haven medical schools in partnership with universities worldwide. The curriculum would emphasize ethical patient care, cultural sensitivity, and protection of vulnerable populations, creating a new generation of healthcare providers trained specifically to serve those who need advocacy most. As the evening winds down, I return to my apartment in the Patricia Hernandez Memorial Medical Center. The space, designed to be both home and sanctuary, overlooks the memorial garden where bronze plaques honor the victims of my parents' crimes. Living here keeps me connected to the mission while providing a constant reminder of why this work matters. The walls display photographs documenting the journey from that scared 17-year-old girl standing on her parents' doorstep to the woman who built a medical empire dedicated to protecting vulnerable families. Pictures show Emma's birth, Dr. Hernandez teaching me midwifery skills, the groundbreaking ceremony for our first birthing center, and the faces of thousands of women who found safety and dignity through Helena's Haven. But the most powerful photograph sits on my nightstand. Rosa Gutierrez holding Sophia at age 5, both of them healthy and thriving despite the trauma they endured. The image represents victory not just over my parents' crimes, but over the cycle of exploitation that threatened to destroy vulnerable families across our community. My laptop contains emails from women worldwide who have heard our story and found courage to speak up about their own experiences with medical exploitation. Healthcare workers from rural communities request guidance on establishing patient advocacy programs. Medical students seek advice on maintaining ethical standards in profit-driven healthcare systems. The transformation continues expanding in ways I never imagined possible when I stood in that boardroom 2 years ago, facing the people who abandoned me. What began as a confrontation with family betrayal has evolved into a global movement protecting pregnant women from exploitation and ensuring that the most vulnerable moment in a woman's life is treated with dignity and respect. Before sleep, I read a letter that arrived today from Rosa Gutierrez, a 19-year-old in Guatemala whose story mirrors my experience of family abandonment during pregnancy. She's working with local healthcare advocates to establish patient protection protocols based on the Helena's Haven model, proving that the impact of our mission extends far beyond Portland's borders.
Your story gave me courage to demand better treatment for pregnant women in my community, Catherine writes. Knowing that someone who faced abandonment and exploitation could build something so powerful shows that our experiences can become strength rather than shame. Tomorrow brings new challenges: a legislative hearing on expanding patient protection laws, a medical conference where I'll present research on trauma-informed maternity care, and a graduation ceremony for 12 women completing our healthcare training program. Each day offers opportunities to extend Dr. Hernandez's legacy while ensuring that no woman faces the kind of abandonment and exploitation that once threatened to destroy my own future. The people who threw me away for bringing life into the world ultimately enabled me to build something greater than they ever imagined. Their greed and cruelty became the foundation for compassion and justice that now protects thousands of vulnerable women and children. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation.
It's about taking the worst betrayals and building something beautiful from the wreckage. It's about ensuring that suffering serves a purpose greater than the pain it caused. Most importantly, it's about proving that family isn't defined by genetics or shared names, but by showing up when someone needs you most. The women who trust Helena's Haven with their most vulnerable moments have become my true family, and their thriving represents the greatest victory over abandonment and exploitation. The scared 17-year-old girl who once stood on her parents' doorstep begging for compassion and finding only coldness has become a woman who ensures that no other girl will face that same abandonment alone. That transformation represents justice in its most complete and meaningful form. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.